The flight from Manchester landed in Accra at 2:15 in the morning, which was the hour that airports existed in their most honest form. Stripped of the daytime performance of arrivals and departures, reduced to what they actually were, which was large buildings full of people in transition, people between one version of their lives and another, people who had left something and had not yet arrived at whatever came next. If this story is already reaching something inside you, take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and drop a like. We are pushing toward 5,000 subscribers, and every single person who joins this family is the reason these stories keep being told. Now let us go back to the airport and to the young man coming through arrivals. His name was Samuel Darko Mensah. He was 31 years old, and he had been in Manchester for 4 years on a postgraduate scholarship that had become, through the specific alchemy of hard work and the right supervisor at the right moment, a research position that had become a publication, that had become a small but genuine reputation in the field of agricultural engineering that nobody at his grandmother's funeral in Kumasi would have been able to describe precisely, but that everyone would have understood, in the general sense, as the kind of thing that made a family proud. He had a single large bag and a carry-on, and the particular tiredness of someone who had not slept properly on the plane because the person in the seat beside him had been a talker. The irreversible kind, the kind who began speaking during takeoff and had not fully concluded by landing, covering in the intervening hours topics that ranged from the price of cement to the spiritual significance of dreams involving water to his nephew's academic performance at a secondary school in Tema. Samuel had listened with the patient, slightly glazed attention of a man too polite to put in his earphones and too tired to fully engage, and had arrived in Accra with the specific depleted quality of someone who had been socially active against their will for 5 hours. He was not supposed to be here, not this week, not this month, not for another 3 months at least. His research position did not officially end until December, and his supervisor, a careful Scottish woman named Dr. Mackenzie, who communicated approval through the precise modulation of her silences rather than through anything as direct as praise, had looked at him across the desk when he said he needed to go home early, and had said after a considered pause that she hoped whatever it was would resolve quickly, which was her version of "I understand and I support you," spoken in the dialect of a person who had been trained by her profession to say as little as possible about anything personal. What had brought Samuel home 3 months early was a phone call. Not from a person he would have expected, not from his father, Kofi, who called on the first Sunday of every month with the regularity of a man fulfilling a subscription, and not from his mother, Adwa, who sent voice messages rather than making calls because she found voice messages gave her more control over the content, and not from either of his 2 older brothers, Emmanuel and Frederick, who did not call unless there was a reason, and who had not, in 4 years, produced a reason. The call had come from his grandmother's neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Akosua Tete Boateng, who was 78 years old, and who had known his grandmother, Madame Abena Darko, for 40 years, and who had called Samuel's number. She had gotten it, she explained, from the address book in Madame Abena's sitting room, which she had access to because she had a key to the house, which Madame Abena had given her 3 years ago for emergencies, and which she was using now because this, Mrs. Tete Boateng said in the specific voice of a woman who had seen things and was not going to pretend otherwise, was an emergency. Madame Abena Darko was 84 years old. She had been a school teacher for 38 years and had retired with the specific dignity of someone who had done their work completely and was now entitled to rest. She lived in the house in Adum that she and her late husband Kweku had built in 1978, a house that Samuel had grown up visiting every school holiday, the house that smelled of the lavender soap his grandmother had used since before he was born, and of the always present pot of something on the stove, and of the particular warm, dusty quality of a Kumasi house in the dry season. She had been his favorite person since he was 4 years old, and he had understood this early and had not been embarrassed by it, which was one of the things about Samuel that his brothers had always found slightly incomprehensible. Mrs. Tete Boateng told him, in the careful, sequential way of a woman who had rehearsed what she was going to say before making the call, that Madame Abena had been admitted to the Komfo Anokie Teaching Hospital 6 weeks ago following a fall that had resulted in a fractured hip, that she had been discharged 3 weeks later into the care of her family, and that in the weeks since her discharge, something had happened that Mrs. Tete Boateng could not fully describe in legal terms, but could describe in human terms, which was that the house felt different, that Madame Abina, when she visited, looked different, that Emmanuel and Frederick were present in the house in a way they had not previously been present, and that there had been men with briefcases and a woman who identified herself as a legal administrator and a judge whose name, Mrs. Tete Boateng, had seen on a document that she had seen only briefly and partially, and that had contained language she did not fully understand, but that had included the words estate, transfer, and power of attorney, and that had been signed by Madame Abina at the kitchen table, with Emmanuel standing beside her and Frederick standing at the doorway, and the legal administrator with the briefcase sitting across from her. Samuel had listened to all of this standing in his small Manchester flat with his coat still on because he had just come in from the lab and had not yet taken it off when the phone rang, and he had listened to the end, and then he had said very quietly, "When was this?" And Mrs. Tete Boateng had said, 11 days ago, and he had said, "Is my grandmother safe?" And she had said, "She is physically safe, she is in the house." But Samuel, and here the old woman's voice had acquired the specific quality of someone about to say the thing they called to say, the thing that all the preceding information had been building toward. "Samuel, she does not look like a woman who made a decision. She looks like a woman who signed something she was told to sign." Samuel had booked his flight at 6 o'clock that morning. He had sent an email to Dr. Mackenzie at 6:15. He had packed his bag at 7. He had been on the plane by noon. He came through Accra arrivals into the 2:15 morning air and found a taxi and rode toward the bus station where the first Kumasi bus left at 4, and sat in the taxi with his large bag between his knees and his carry-on on the seat beside him, and looked out at the Accra night and thought about his grandmother. He thought about the last time he had seen her, 8 months ago, before he went back to Manchester after the Christmas visit. She had stood at the gate of the Adam house in her good wrapper and her house slippers, and had held his face in both her hands and looked at him the way she always looked at him when he was leaving, with the specific, unguarded love of a woman who did not perform her feelings for his comfort, but simply had them, fully and visibly, which had always been both the gift and the weight of her love. He had said he would be back at Christmas. She had said she would be here. He thought about the phone call. He thought about the words estate and transfer and power of attorney. He thought about Emmanuel standing beside her at the kitchen table and Frederick at the doorway, and the woman with the briefcase sitting across from her, and he thought about his grandmother's face as Mrs. Tete Boateng had described it. Not the face of a woman who made a decision. The face of a woman who signed what she was told to sign. The bus to Kumasi left at 4:10, slightly late, with the unhurried acceptance of a service that operated on a schedule that was more aspirational than binding. Samuel sat by the window and watched the Accra outskirts give way to the Accra-Kumasi road, and the road give way to the darkness of the Ghanaian interior at 4 in the morning. The occasional village light and the occasional roadside fire, and the long, dark stretches of forest that the headlights barely touched. He did not sleep. He sat with his hands in his lap and thought about what he knew and what he did not know, and what the difference between those two things would require of him when the bus reached Kumasi and he stood outside the Adam house and knocked on the gate and waited for his grandmother to answer. He knew Emmanuel. He knew Frederick. He had grown up beside them and understood them with the specific completeness that siblings understood each other. Not always charitably, not always accurately, but completely, in the sense that he knew the shape of who they were in a way that went below the surface of their behavior and into the structure of their motivations. Emmanuel was 41 and had always been the brother who confused wanting with deserving, who looked at what other people had and understood it as something he was owed rather than something they had earned. Frederick was 38 and had always been the brother who followed Emmanuel in the specific way that certain younger siblings followed certain older ones, not out of admiration exactly, but out of the path of least resistance, which was a form of moral laziness that produced over years the same results as active malice without requiring the same self-awareness. He had always known this about them. He had always hoped it would not become what it was apparently becoming. The bus moved through the dark Ghanaian interior, and Samuel sat with his hands in his lap and hoped still that Mrs. Tete Boateng had misread the situation, that the document she had seen was something other than what it appeared to be. that Emmanuel and Frederick had done something complicated but ultimately defensible, that his grandmother's face had carried what it carried for reasons that had nothing to do with coercion. He hoped this with the full knowledge that hope was not the same as expectation, and that the 4-hour bus ride to Kumasi was going to end with him at a gate in Adam, and that what he found on the other side of that gate was going to be what it was, regardless of what he had hoped on the way there. The Adam house looked the same from the outside. This was the first thing Samuel noticed when the taxi from the Kumasi station turned onto the street at 7:20 in the morning, and he saw the gate, the same iron gate, painted the same deep green that his grandfather Kweku had chosen in 1978, and that had been repainted twice since his death, each time the same color, because Madame Abina said the color was correct, and that correct things did not need to be revised. The compound wall was the same. The single pawpaw tree visible above the wall on the left side was the same, slightly taller than he remembered, which was the only thing about the house that ever changed incrementally enough to be noticeable. He paid the driver and stood on the street with his large bag at his feet and his carry-on on his shoulder and looked at the gate for a moment. It was 7:20 in the morning, and Madame Abina was an early riser. She had been waking at 5:30 for 60 years and had said once that the body, once trained to a habit, did not consult the age of the person it belonged to before continuing the habit. She would be awake. She might be in the kitchen. She might be on the veranda in the morning light with her Bible, which was where she spent the first hour after her morning prayers when the weather permitted. He pushed the gate open. It made the same sound. The compound was swept. The broom lines were fresh, which meant someone had swept this morning, which meant Madame Abina was up and functional, which settled one of the fears that had been sitting at the back of his mind since Manchester. He crossed the compound toward the main house. The veranda was empty. The kitchen window was open, and there was the smell of something cooking, which was normal and which steadied him further. He knocked on the main door. Footsteps. The door opened. It was not Madame Abina. It was a young woman he did not recognize, perhaps 25, in house clothes, with the slightly startled expression of someone who had not expected a visitor at this hour and who was assessing him with the rapid, cautious evaluation of someone who had been told to be careful about who she let in. "Who are you?" Samuel said, not unkindly. "I am Afia," she said. "I am here to help Madam." "Since when?" 3 weeks. "Since she came back from the hospital." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him with the specific combination of guardedness and uncertainty of someone who had been placed in a position by other people and was not entirely sure whose interests she was serving. "I am Samuel," he said. "Madam's grandson. Tell her I am here." Afia's expression shifted. The guardedness remained, but something else arrived alongside it, something that might have been relief, which told Samuel something he filed away carefully. She stepped back and let him in, and went down the corridor toward the back of the house, and he heard her voice, and then, after a moment, a sound that was not a voice but was immediately recognizable. The specific sound of his grandmother's slippers on the tile floor, the particular shuffle and step of someone managing a hip that had been fractured and repaired, and was still, 3 weeks post-discharge, conducting its own slow negotiation with the rest of the body. She appeared in the corridor doorway. She was smaller than he remembered, which was the thing that happened to very old people in the interval between visits. They became more distilled, more concentrated, more themselves, and simultaneously more fragile, as though the years were performing a reduction that increased the essence while decreasing the volume. She was wearing her blue house wrapper, and her slippers and her reading glasses were on her face rather than her forehead, which meant she had been reading rather than thinking when Afia had told her he was here. She looked at him. He looked at her. And in the 4 seconds before either of them moved or spoke, Samuel read his grandmother's face with the completeness that 4 years of distance and the phone call from Mrs. Tete Boateng had sharpened in him, and what he read was not what he had hoped to read on the bus from Accra. It was what he had feared. Not fear exactly. She was not a frightened woman, Madame Abena, and whatever had been done to her had not taken that. But there was something in her face that had not been there 8 months ago, a quality of restraint that was not her natural quality, the specific restraint of someone who has learned recently that certain things in their own house must be carefully navigated, which was not an expression that belonged on the face of a woman in her own home, and which made something tighten in Samuel's chest that did not loosen when she opened her arms, and he walked into them and held her. She held him back. She held him with the strength she always had, the strength that surprised people who had not held her before, the strength of a woman whose body had decided that whatever else it was going to relinquish to age, it was going to keep this. "You did not tell me you were coming," she said against his shoulder. "I wanted to surprise you," he said, which was true as far as it went. She stepped back and held his face in both her hands and looked at him the way she always looked at him, and then said in a voice that was entirely her own and entirely steady, "You look thin. Manchester does not feed you." "Manchester feeds me fine, Grandma." "Come and eat," she said. They went to the kitchen. Afia was already at the stove, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned the kitchen's geography quickly and who cooked competently, if not with the specific authority of the person whose kitchen it was. Madame Abena sat at the kitchen table in her spot, and Samuel sat across from her, and Afia served without being asked, kenki and fish stew, which was what was on the stove, which was what Madame Abena had been making on Tuesday mornings since before Samuel's father was born. They ate. Samuel watched his grandmother eat and watched the kitchen and watched Afia moving at the periphery and felt the specific quality of a room that had been rearranged in ways that were not visible but that were present. The way you felt a room that had been rearranged in the dark. Everything approximately where it should be, but nothing quite in its exact position. When Afia went to the back of the house for something, Samuel said quietly, "Grandma, Mrs. Tete Boateng called me." Madame Abena's hands stilled on her bowl, just for a moment. Then she resumed eating. "Akosua," she said. "She worries too much." "She told me about the document," Samuel said. "The one you signed at this table 11 days ago." Madame Abena looked at her food. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the kitchen window, the Kumasi morning was conducting its business. A motor passing, a vendor's call somewhere down the street. The specific urban texture of an Asante city at 8 in the morning. "Emmanuel said it was for my protection," she said. Her voice was careful. Not defensive, his grandmother was not a defensive woman, but careful in the way of someone managing the distance between what they said and what they knew. "What kind of protection?" Samuel said. "He said that with my age and the hospital. He said that having the property in only my name was a risk. He said that if anything happened to me quickly, there would be complications. He said the document would make sure that the family could act without delays." "Did you read it?" "The print was small," she said. "And the woman who brought it, she explained it. She said it was a standard arrangement." "Did you have your own lawyer look at it?" Madame Abena looked up from her food and met his eyes, and in the meeting of their eyes was the answer, which was no, and the reason for the answer, which was that she had been in the house 3 weeks post-discharge with a fractured hip that was still requiring management, and 2 sons who had been present and attentive and warm in the specific way that had made their presence feel like care when it was. Samuel was increasingly certain something else, and that in that configuration, the suggestion of her own lawyer had not been made and had therefore not been taken. "Grandma," he said, "I need to see the document." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, in the voice she used for true things, "Emmanuel took it. He said he would keep it safely." Samuel set down his spoon. He set it down carefully and looked at his grandmother across the kitchen table in the house that her husband had built in 1978 and that she had lived in for 46 years, and that was, he was now nearly certain, in the process of being taken from her by 2 of her own grandsons, while she sat in it with a healing hip and a young helper who had been placed there by those same grandsons and who slept in the back room and was present for every conversation and who had looked at Samuel when he arrived with an expression that might have been relief. "I'm going to find out what was in that document," Samuel said. He said it quietly and without drama and without anger in his voice, which was the tone he used for things he was entirely serious about. "I know what was in it," Madame Abena said. Samuel looked at her. She had put down her own spoon now and was looking at the table with the expression of a woman who has been carrying something alone and has reached the point where the carrying alone must end. "Tell me," he said. "A power of attorney," she said. "Full authority. over the house, the accounts, everything. She paused. And Emmanuel also told me, 2 days after I signed it, that he had spoken with a judge, a friend of his. He said the judge had already looked at the arrangement and confirmed it was in order. He said it with the confidence of a man telling you something is finished. The kitchen was very quiet. Afia had not returned from the back of the house. Outside, the morning continued. Samuel sat across from his grandmother in the kitchen that smelled of kenki and fish stew and the lavender soap that had been the smell of this house his whole life, and felt the full shape of what had been done arrive in him completely, the power of attorney and the house and the accounts and the judge. And he felt it without letting it become the thing that happened to him in this kitchen, because this kitchen was his grandmother's kitchen, and what happened in it this morning needed to be about her, and not about his response to what had been done to her. He reached across the table and covered her hands with his. Her hands were warm and slightly rough and entirely familiar. "Grandma," he said, "do you trust me?" She looked at him. "I have trusted you since you were 4 years old," she said. "Then let me handle this," he said. "Not Emmanuel's way, not Frederick's way, the right way." Madame Abena looked at her grandson for a long moment with the clear, assessing eyes that had been reading people accurately for 84 years. Then she turned her hands over under his and held his hands back and said, "In Twai," the phrase that in her language meant "I am putting this in your hands," which was the highest form of trust she had available and which she did not deploy casually, and which Samuel received with the full weight of what it was. "Are you watching this from Kumasi, Accra, London, New York, Toronto, or somewhere else in this world? Drop your location in the comments right now and hit that like button. We are so close to 5,000 subscribers, and every single person who subscribes is the reason these stories keep reaching the people who need them most." The law office of Nana Ama Boteng Asante was on Harper Road in Kumasi, on the second floor of a building that had a tailor's shop on the ground floor and an accounting firm on the first, and that communicated, in its layered, practical arrangement, the specific character of a city that had been conducting serious business for a very long time and had never required grandeur as a precondition for seriousness. Samuel found it at 10:15 after a 40-minute walk from the Adam house, during which he had called 3 numbers, his university friend Kweku, who had studied law before switching to finance, and who knew the Kumasi legal landscape the way people knew landscapes they had chosen not to work in, but had observed carefully. His father Kofi, who had not answered, which was not surprising, and Mrs. Tete Boateng, who had answered on the first ring and who had given him Nana Ama Boateng Asante's name in the specific way that people gave names they had been holding in readiness, as though they had known the name would be needed and had kept it available for the moment. He had not told Emmanuel or Frederick he was in Kumasi. He had thought about this on the walk, whether announcing his presence was the right approach, whether the element of Emmanuel not knowing he was here was an advantage worth preserving, and had decided that the advantage was worth preserving for at least this morning, for at least the time it took to sit across from a lawyer and understand what had actually been signed and what it meant, and what, if anything, could be done about what it meant. Nana Ama Boateng Asante was 52 years old and had been practicing law in Kumasi for 26 of those years, which meant she had been practicing law in this city since before Samuel was born, which meant she had seen most of what the city's legal landscape produced and had developed, across those years, the specific professional composure of someone who could not be surprised by human behavior, but who had not yet stopped being interested in it. She was a tall woman, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the kind of direct, unhurried manner that communicated immediately that her time was organized around outcomes rather than impressions. She had agreed to see Samuel at 10 because his call at 8:45 had contained, in its brief description of the situation, enough of the right specific details: power of attorney, post-hospitalization, family pressure, a judge's name, to tell her that what was being described was not ambiguous and was not a case of family misunderstanding that a good conversation would resolve. Samuel sat across her desk and told her everything. He told her in the sequence that had by now become practiced: Mrs. Tete Boateng's call, the flight from Manchester, the bus from Accra, the Adam house and Afia, and his grandmother at the kitchen table, the document, and what Madame Abena had told him about its contents and about Emmanuel's mention of the judge. He told her the judge's name, which his grandmother had remembered with the precision of a woman whose memory for significant details remained entirely intact, even when other things about her situation had been made uncertain. Nana Ama wrote the name on her notepad. She wrote it and looked at it and set her pen down, and looked at Samuel with an expression that was not surprise, and was not quite the absence of surprise, but was something in between. The expression of a professional encountering a specific name in a specific context and recognizing it as a name she had encountered in similar contexts before. "Justice Kwame Antwi Boafo," she said. "Your brother mentioned him by name." My grandmother said Emmanuel mentioned him by name. 2 days after the document was signed, he said the judge had already confirmed the arrangement was in order. Nana Ama looked at her notepad. She picked up her pen and tapped it twice against the paper, which Samuel would come to understand was the gesture she made when she was thinking rather than writing. And then she said, "Justice Antwi Boafo retired from the bench 14 months ago. He now consults in a private capacity for several legal firms in Kumasi. His name has come up in 2 other matters I am aware of in the past 8 months, both involving elderly individuals, both involving documents signed in post-medical event vulnerability, both involving property." She paused. "In both of those cases, the documents were upheld because the signatures were present and the witnesses were technically compliant. One of those cases is still being appealed." Samuel looked at the lawyer across her desk and felt the specific, cold clarity of a pattern being identified. Not a single act of opportunism by 2 brothers who had seen a moment and taken it, but something more organized, more deliberate. The use of a retired judge's name and residual authority as an instrument of legitimization deployed against elderly people in the specific vulnerability of post-hospitalization when families were present in houses in new configurations and documents. Appeared with explanations, and pens were held towards signatures by people who were trusted because they were family. "What was in the document my grandmother signed?" he said. "We need to find that out precisely," Nana Ama said. "Your grandmother does not have a copy." "Emmanuel took it. He said he would keep it safely." She nodded. The nod of a woman receiving confirmation of something she had already expected. A power of attorney of the kind your grandmother described, full authority over property and accounts. If it was properly executed, gives your brothers the legal capacity to transfer the house, to access and withdraw from the accounts, and to make decisions about her care without requiring her ongoing consent. She paused. If it was properly executed. And if it was not, then it is challengeable. A power of attorney signed by an elderly person in a post-hospitalization context, without independent legal advice, without the signatory being informed of the full implications, without a cooling-off period. These are grounds. They are not automatic grounds, but they are real ones. Emmanuel mentioned a judge, Samuel said. He mentioned Antwi Boafo by name as someone who had confirmed the arrangement. What does that mean legally? Nana Ama looked at him steadily. "It means nothing legally," she said. "A retired judge has no judicial authority. His opinion, in a private capacity, carries no legal weight, but it carries significant psychological weight when it is delivered to an 84-year-old woman who has been told that a judge has already looked at this and confirmed it is in order." She paused. "It is designed to foreclose the question, to make the signing feel like a formality rather than a decision. To remove the space in which your grandmother might have said, 'Let me think about this. Let me speak to my own lawyer. Let me call Samuel.'" Samuel felt the architecture of it arrive in him completely. The hospital, the discharge into the care of Emmanuel and Frederick. Afia installed in the house, not maliciously perhaps, but functionally, as a presence that was also an observation, a pair of eyes that reported to the people who had placed her there. The document arriving 11 days after discharge, when his grandmother was still managing a healing hip and the disorientation of returning to her own house under new conditions. The explanation that made it sound like protection. The pen held toward the signature line. And then 2 days later, the mention of the judge's name, delivered not as information, but as a closing, as the final word that was designed to ensure that the question, once put to rest, stayed at rest. He thought about Mrs. Tete Boteng, with the key that Madame Abena had given her for emergencies, who had seen the document briefly and partially and had read enough to be alarmed, and who had found Samuel's number in his grandmother's address book and had called Manchester at a time when calling Manchester was not a small thing to do. He thought about what would have happened if she had not called. "What do we do?" he said. Nana Ama opened a drawer and took out a form and set it on the desk. "First," she said, "you sign a formal instruction retaining me as your grandmother's legal representative with your grandmother's co-signature, which I will obtain in person when I visit her this afternoon. This establishes representation and means that any institution, any bank, any property registry that receives a request regarding your grandmother's affairs will be required to notify my office. Can you visit this afternoon?" "I can visit at 2, she said. "Second, I will apply today to the Lands Commission for a search on the Adam property to determine whether any transfer has already been initiated. If the power of attorney has already been used to begin a transfer, we need to know immediately, and we need to file a caveat before anything is registered." "How quickly can a transfer be initiated?" "With a valid power of attorney, a motivated party can begin the process within days," she said. "The registration takes longer, but the initiation is fast. We do not know when the document was signed precisely or what has been done with it in the 11 days since." Samuel looked at the Harper Road street through Nana Ama's window. The Kumasi morning, the traffic, the specific density of a city going about its business with the indifference that cities brought to individual human situations, which was not cruelty, but simply scale. He thought about Emmanuel. He thought about the phone call he had not made this morning, the announcement of his presence he had withheld. He thought about how long that advantage could be preserved, and what it was worth, and what it would cost when it ended, as it would end, as Emmanuel discovered that Samuel was in Kumasi, and that Samuel had a lawyer on Harper Road, and that the arrangement he had constructed with considerable care around an 84-year-old woman's healing hip and a retired judge's name was being examined by someone whose examination could not be redirected by warmth, or by explanations about protection, or by... The pen held toward the signature line. "There is something else," Samuel said. Nana Ama looked at him. "The judge," he said. "Antwi Boafo. If his name has come up in 2 other similar matters in 8 months, if this is a pattern rather than a single incident, then it is a matter that goes beyond your grandmother's situation," Nana Ama said. Her voice was level and entirely without drama. "Yes." Samuel looked at the lawyer across her desk. "I am a researcher," he said. "I know how to document things. I know how to build a record. If there are other families, other elderly people, other documents signed under these circumstances with this name attached to them..." "One thing at a time," Nana Ama said. But she said it with the specific quality of a woman who had also thought about this and who was not dismissing it, but was correctly prioritizing it, which was the approach of a lawyer who understood that the most important thing right now was the 84-year-old woman in the Adum house, and that everything else, however significant, was secondary to making sure she was protected before the afternoon was over. 2 o'clock, she said. "I will be at the house." Samuel stood and shook her hand and went back down the stairs past the accounting firm and the tailor's shop and out onto Harper Road and stood in the Kumasi morning and took out his phone. He had one call to make that he had been postponing since Manchester. Not to Emmanuel, not to Frederick. To his father Kofi, who had not answered at 8:45 and who needed to answer now because what was happening in the Adam house was happening to Kofi's mother, and Kofi needed to know it and needed to decide what kind of son he was going to be about it, which was a decision Samuel could not make for him, but could ensure he had the information to make for himself. He called. It rang 4 times. Then Kofi's voice, slightly rough with the morning, answered. "Samuel." "Papa," Samuel said. "I am in Kumasi. I need you to listen to me carefully." Kofi Darko Mensah was 58 years old and had spent most of those years being the middle person in situations that required someone to be the middle person. Between his mother and his brothers, when the brothers were young and difficult. Between his wife and her family during the early years of the marriage. Between his own ambitions and the modest resources available to pursue them. Between the version of himself he had intended to become and the version he had actually become, which was a good man who had never been tested in the specific way that revealed whether good men were also brave men. He received Samuel's call at his kitchen table in Takoradi, where he had lived for 22 years, with his second cup of tea in front of him and the morning news on the television in the next room, and he listened to his son's voice for 12 minutes without speaking, which was unusual for Kofi, who was not a silent man by nature, and whose silence across those 12 minutes communicated to Samuel, who knew his father well, that what was being said was landing in a place that had been prepared for it, that some part of Kofi had known something was wrong and had chosen not to examine it, and was now being required to examine it whether he chose to or not. When Samuel finished, Kofi was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you known?" "Since Mrs. Tete Boateng called me 5 days ago," Samuel said. "I was on a plane the next morning." Another pause. "I should have called you," Kofi said. "When Emmanuel told me about the document, I should have called you and I didn't." Samuel was standing on Harper Road in the Kumasi morning with his phone to his ear and the traffic moving around him, and he heard his father's words and understood what they meant. That Kofi had known about the document, that Emmanuel had told him, that he had received the information and had not acted on it, and had not called Samuel, and had not called a lawyer, and had not gone to Kumasi himself. He stood with this for a moment without speaking, because his father had said it himself and had not tried to frame it differently or make it more comfortable, which was itself a form of honesty that deserved to be received rather than immediately responded to. "Emmanuel told me it was for her protection," Kofi said. "He said she was vulnerable and the property needed to be secured. He said the arrangement was legal and proper. He said a judge had confirmed it." "Did you believe him?" A long pause. "I wanted to believe him," Kofi said. "That is not the same thing, and I know it is not the same thing." Samuel looked at the Harper Road traffic. He thought about what Nana Ama had said, the pattern, the two other elderly people, the document signed in post-hospitalization vulnerability, the retired judge's name used as a closing mechanism. He thought about his father in Takoradi with his morning tea and his television, receiving Emmanuel's explanation and choosing the version of events that required the least of him, which was a choice that had consequences, which was a choice whose consequences were now being addressed by his 31-year-old son on a street in Kumasi. "Papa," he said, "I need you to come to Kumasi." "Samuel, I need you to come to Kumasi today, not tomorrow. Today, I have a lawyer. She is visiting Grandma at 2 o'clock. I need you there. Emmanuel will know I am there." "Yes," Samuel said, "he will. That is part of why you need to be there." A silence. Long enough that Samuel heard the Takoradi morning in the background of the call, a different texture from the Kumasi morning, the specific sound of a different city conducting its business. Then Kofi said, "I will take the noon bus." Samuel ended the call and stood for a moment on Harper Road and felt the specific quality of a situation that was still in motion but had acquired in the past 2 hours enough structure to feel addressable, which was different from feeling resolved but was the necessary precondition for resolution. He walked back to the Adam house. He went through the gate and across the compound and found his grandmother on the veranda in the morning light, which was where he had thought she might be, in her veranda chair with her Bible open on her lap and her reading glasses on her face. The morning configuration of a woman whose daily rituals had survived hip fracture and post-hospitalization, and the arrival of an unfamiliar helper and 2 grandsons with a document which told Samuel something important about the specific durability of his grandmother's interior life. He sat in the chair beside her, the second veranda chair, the one that had been his grandfather's chair and that had remained in that association across the years of his grandfather's absence, in the way that certain objects remained in permanent association with people who were no longer there to use them. Madame Abena looked up from her Bible and looked at him and said, "You went out." "I went to see a lawyer," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good. Just that. Good." He told her about Nana Ama Boateng Asante, her 26 years of Kumasi practice, her visit at 2. He told her about his call to Kofi and that his father was coming on the noon bus. He told her about the Lands Commission search that Nana Ama was initiating and what it was designed to find, and what it would prevent if it found it. He told her all of it in the same careful, sequential way he had told Mrs. Tete Boteng's call to Dr. Mackenzie and the contents of the document to Nana Ama, because his grandmother deserved to know every step being taken on her behalf, and because she was 84 years old with a clear mind and the right to be a participant in the protection of her own life rather than simply its recipient. Madame Abina listened. She listened with the Bible still open in her lap and her reading glasses still on her face and the Kumasi morning still moving around the veranda, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "This judge, the one Emmanuel mentioned." "Justice Antwi Boafo," Samuel said. "His name has come up in similar situations before. 2 others that the lawyer knows of." Madame Abina looked at the compound, at the pawpaw tree, at the gate. She looked at the physical space of her life for a long moment, with the expression of a woman taking inventory, not of the space itself, but of the 46 years it contained. And then she said, "I knew something was wrong when he mentioned the judge. I knew it because your grandfather, God rest him, used to say that when someone tells you a powerful person has already approved something, they are trying to make you feel that your own judgment is unnecessary." She paused. "I knew it, and I did not say anything because Emmanuel was standing there and Frederick was in the doorway and I was 3 weeks out of the hospital and I was tired in a way that went deeper than the hip." She looked at Samuel. "That is not an excuse. I want you to understand that I know it is not an excuse. I signed what I signed, and I knew something was wrong when I signed it." "Grandma, let me finish," she said. Her voice was entirely steady. "I am telling you this because I want you to understand something. I am not a woman who does not know her own mind. I have never been that woman. But I am 84 years old, and I was tired and they were warm and present in the way that my grandchildren are not always warm and present, and I allowed the warmth to substitute for my judgment. That is a specific failure, and I own it." Samuel looked at his grandmother on the veranda of her house in the morning light and felt the specific emotion that arrived when someone you loved took full account of themselves without diminishment and without excuse, which was one of the most serious things a person could do, and which his grandmother had just done at 84 years old, from a veranda chair while managing a healing hip. "It is not a failure," he said. "It is what they were designed to produce in you. The warmth, the timing, the judge's name, it was designed specifically for who you are and what you are going through. That is not your failure. That is their calculation." Madame Abina looked at him. Then she said, "In Twi, a proverb that translated roughly as the trap is not the fault of the animal, it is the fault of the person who set it." Samuel nodded. They sat on the veranda in the morning light and said nothing for a while, and the Kumasi morning moved around them, and the pawpaw tree stood in its patient, producing way, and the compound that Kweku had built in 1978 held them both in its familiar, specific geometry. At 11:40, Emmanuel arrived. He came through the gate without knocking, which was the way he had always come through this gate, with the ownership of someone for whom the removal of the gate's permission had become, at some point, an assumption rather than a courtesy. He was 41 years old and had their grandfather's height and their father's ease in social situations and a confidence that had curdled over the years in the way that Samuel had always known it would curdle, into the specific arrogance of a man who had confused his family's inheritance with his own achievement. He came through the gate and stopped when he saw Samuel on the veranda. He stopped completely, which was not his usual quality of movement, and in the stopping, Samuel saw the precise moment when Emmanuel understood that the configuration of the morning was not the configuration he had left yesterday, and that the difference between the configuration he had left and the one he was looking at now had a name, and the name was standing on the veranda beside their grandmother. He recovered quickly. He was always quick. "Samuel," he said, with the warmth that was always his first instrument. "You did not tell us you were coming." "I wanted to surprise Grandma," Samuel said. Emmanuel came up the veranda steps and embraced him. The embrace of brothers who are not currently enemies and are not currently friends, and who understand that the embrace is a form of information gathering as much as a form of greeting. Samuel felt his brother's body register the fact of his presence, calculate its implications, begin to adapt. "When did you arrive?" Emmanuel said. "Last night," Samuel said. Which was true. Emmanuel looked at their grandmother. Madame Abena looked back at her eldest grandson with the expression Samuel had seen her use for difficult things. Not hostile, not warm, but entirely present. The full attention of a woman who was no longer tired in the specific way she had been tired 11 days ago, and who was this morning on her own veranda in her own house in the morning light, reading the face of the person who had stood in her kitchen doorway while a pen was held toward her signature. "You look well, Grandma," Emmanuel said. "I am well," she said. "Samuel is here." "Yes," Emmanuel said. He looked at his brother again. Something moved through his face that was quick and controlled, but not entirely invisible. The calculation of a man assessing a changed situation and deciding on his approach. Then he smiled. The gap-toothed smile that had always been his most effective instrument, and that was, this morning, being deployed against a brother who had spent the past 2 hours on Harper Road and was not available to be disarmed by it. "Let us go inside," Emmanuel said. "We have things to discuss." "Yes," Samuel said, "we do." The sitting room of the Adam house had not changed in the 46 years since Kweku had furnished it with the specific, unhurried choices of a man who understood that the things you put in a room were the things you would live with, and that living with things required them to be right rather than merely present. The sofa was the third iteration of the same sofa. Same position, same dark fabric, reupholstered twice, and the center table was original, and the cabinet along the left wall that held the good china and the family photographs was original, and the photograph of Kweku and Madame Abena at their 25th wedding anniversary was in its same position above the cabinet, Kweku in his kente cloth and Madame Abena in the matching fabric that she still had in the wardrobe upstairs, both of them, looking at the camera with the expression of people who had built something together and were in the middle of it and knew it. Samuel sat on the sofa beside his grandmother. Emmanuel sat in the armchair across from them. Frederick had arrived 10 minutes after Emmanuel, coming through the gate with the slightly less composed energy of a younger brother who had received a call from an older one and had been told to come quickly, and who had come quickly without fully understanding why quickly was required, and who had arrived to find Samuel on the veranda and had produced in the production of his surprise slightly less control than Emmanuel had produced, which told Samuel that Frederick's involvement in what had been done was real but was secondary. The involvement of a man who had been told a direction and had followed it rather than the involvement of a man who had chosen the direction himself. Frederick sat in the second armchair. Afia had been sent by Madame Abena to the market with a list of specific items written in the old woman's deliberate handwriting, a list complete enough to require at least an hour, which was the specific completeness of a woman who knew how to create time and space when time and space were required. The four of them were alone. Emmanuel looked at Samuel with the composed, assessing quality he had been deploying since the veranda and said, in the voice of a man opening a negotiation he has decided he is going to control, "It is good that you are here, Samuel. There are things about Grandma's situation that we should discuss, as a family." "I understand her situation," Samuel said. "Tell me what you think I do not understand." A brief recalibration in Emmanuel's expression. Then, the property, the arrangements. With her age in the hospital, we had to make sure things were in order. That is all this was. "You had to make sure things were in order," Samuel said. "So you had a document prepared, a full power of attorney, over the house and the accounts, without telling me, without telling Papa, without giving Grandma independent legal advice, without a cooling-off period. And then you mentioned a retired judge's name as though his private opinion carried judicial authority, which it does not, in order to close the space in which she might have reconsidered." The sitting room was very quiet. Frederick was looking at his hands. Emmanuel was looking at Samuel with an expression that had moved through several configurations and had arrived at the one underneath all the performance, the actual face of the man. "You went to a lawyer," he said. "This morning," Samuel said. "Nana Ama Boateng Asante on Harper Road. She is visiting at 2 o'clock to formally establish legal representation for Grandma. She has also initiated a search at the Lands Commission to determine whether any transfer has been filed and to place a caveat if it has." Emmanuel was quiet. Then, "You moved fast." "Yes," Samuel said. "I did." "Samuel, Let me finish." His voice was even and entirely without theatre, which was the most serious register available to him. "I know what Antwi Boafo's name has been used for. Nana Ama knows of 2 other cases in the past 8 months. Elderly people, post-hospitalization, documents signed without independent advice. His name used to close the question before it was fully asked. I know the pattern, Emmanuel, and I know your name is going to appear in the documentation of that pattern if this proceeds." Frederick looked up from his hands. He looked at his older brother and then at Samuel, and the specific quality of his face in that moment confirmed what Samuel had already assessed. Frederick was at the edge of the plan, not its center, standing in the doorway while the pen was held toward the signature line, present and complicit, but not the architect. "Frederick," Samuel said, his voice shifting slightly. "You were in the doorway. You watched it happen." Emmanuel said it was legal, Frederick said quietly. "He said it was for her protection." "Did you believe him?" Frederick was quiet for a moment. "I told myself I believed him," he said. "I think you know what that means." "Yes," Samuel said. "I know exactly what it means." Madame Abina had been silent since the conversation began. She sat beside Samuel with her hands folded in her lap and the watchful, present expression of a woman who had been holding her full response in reserve until the moment required it. The moment had arrived. She looked at Emmanuel. She looked at him the way she had looked at him across 41 years of his life, as his grandmother, with the specific knowing of someone who had held him as an infant and carried every version of him since. "Emmanuel," she said, "tell me what you needed the money for." The sitting room received this. Emmanuel looked at his grandmother, and his face moved through its configurations and arrived slowly and with visible effort at the one underneath all the others. "The business," he said. His voice was quieter than it had been since he walked through the gate. "There are debts, significant ones. I have been managing them for 2 years, and I have run out of ways to manage them." "How significant?" he told her. The number arrived in the sitting room and sat there in the afternoon light. Frederick's expression confirmed that he had not known the full figure either. Emmanuel had shared enough to secure his presence and his silence, but had not shared the whole picture, which meant Frederick had been used as much as he had participated. Madame Abina was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the photograph of Kweku above the cabinet, held it with her eyes for 10 seconds, then looked at Emmanuel. "You should have come to me," she said, "as your grandmother, not with documents and lawyers and a retired judge's name. Simply come and sat where you are sitting now and said, 'Grandma, I am in trouble and I need help.'" Emmanuel looked at the carpet. "I was ashamed," he said. "I know," she said. "I could see it in you when you came after the hospital. I thought the shame was about my falling. I understand now it was about the other thing." She placed her hands flat on her knees. "Shame is not a reason for what you did," she continued. "It is an explanation. Those are different things, and I need you to understand the difference. What you did was wrong. It was wrong to bring a document to this table and hold a pen toward me and use a judge's name to close the space where my own judgment should have lived. That was wrong, Emmanuel. I am telling you clearly, and I will not soften it." "Look at me," she said. He looked at her. "It was wrong," she said again. "Yes, Grandma," he said, the voice of a man found completely. "Now," she said, her voice shifting from the difficult part to the necessary part, "we are going to fix it. The document will be withdrawn. The lawyer will handle the legal process. And when that is done, when the house is back where it belongs, and my name is back where it belongs, you and I are going to sit at the kitchen table, and you are going to tell me everything about the business, every number, every debt, every name. And we are going to find a solution that does not require anyone to sign anything they do not fully understand." She looked at Frederick. "You too," she said. "Whatever you are carrying that you have not said, you bring it to that table." Frederick nodded, with the nod of a man whose load was being redistributed to a larger surface. Nana Ama Boteng Asante arrived at 2 o'clock precisely, with her leather bag and her reading glasses on their chain, and the professional composure of a woman who had done this before. She produced the withdrawal documentation for Emmanuel's signature, the formal revocation of the power of attorney, signed in the full presence of his grandmother and his brothers, and witnessed and dated with that afternoon's date, and the formal letter of legal representation that Madame Abena signed with the clear, deliberate signature Samuel had watched her produce his whole life. Kofi arrived at 3:15 on a bus that had been delayed at Obuasi. He came through the gate with his travel bag and his expression of a man who had spent 3 hours on a bus accounting for himself, and who had arrived at an accounting he was not satisfied with, but intended to begin correcting. He held his mother on the veranda for a long time and said something in Twi that Samuel could not hear, and then went inside and looked at Emmanuel and Frederick and said, in the voice of a father who has arrived late and knows it, "I should have come sooner. I am here now." It was not absolution. It was not punishment. It was a man telling the truth about himself in front of the people who needed to hear it, which was the most useful thing available in that sitting room. That evening, after Nana Amma had gone with her signed documents, and the revocation was filed, and the caveat removed, and the letter of representation registered, the family sat at Madame Abena's kitchen table and ate together. Afia had returned from the market and had cooked groundnut soup with fufu, competent and nourishing if not quite the soup that the kitchen was known for, which Madame Abena acknowledged with a single nod that communicated appreciation and the gentle maintenance of a standard simultaneously. They ate and they talked, and some of the talking was about the business, and some of it was about other things, and none of it was easy, and all of it was necessary, which was the quality of conversations that happened after something serious had been addressed, and the addressing had cost everyone at the table something real. Samuel sat beside his grandmother and ate and looked at the kitchen that smelled of lavender soap and cooking, and 46 years of a life built faithfully in this house, and he thought about Mrs. Tete Boateng, the old woman with the key, who had seen something wrong through a partially visible document and had found a number in an address book and had called Manchester. The specific, unremarkable heroism of a neighbor who could have decided it was not her business and had decided instead that it was precisely her business, which was the decision that had made everything else possible. After dinner, Samuel went to the veranda. He sat in his grandfather's chair in the Kumasi evening and felt the specific quality of a day that had been worth every hour of the overnight bus, and the 4-hour road, and the walk to Harper Road, and the call to his father, and all the rest of it. Madame Abena came at 8. She sat in her chair and opened her Bible, and read for a while, and then closed it and looked at the compound and said, without turning, "Your grandfather would have liked you very much." Samuel looked at the pawpaw tree in its corner. "I know," he said. He did. She almost smiled. They sat together on the veranda in the Kumasi evening, the house behind them lit and inhabited and standing as it had stood since 1978, and the night arrived over Adam with the patience of something that did not require permission, and the compound held them in its familiar geometry, and the pawpaw tree stood producing and faithful and entirely itself, which was perhaps the best available instruction for how to live a life that was worth the living. And if you have stayed with this story until this very last word, then you already know what the elders have always known. The grandchild who returns is worth more than the ones who stayed for the wrong reasons. And an old woman's signature is not anyone's to take. It is hers to give, in full knowledge, with full choice, to whoever has earned it. Share this story right now with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. We are so close to 5,000 subscribers, and every single person who joins this family is the reason these stories keep being told. Are you watching from Kumasi, Accra, Lagos, London, Toronto, New York, or somewhere else in this beautiful world? Drop your country in the comments below, because your presence here is what makes this community real. As the elders say, the tree that forgets its roots will not survive the storm. But the tree that remembers, that tree stands for generations,